Hi everyone, welcome to a new episode of VFX Notes. I'm Ian Fales from Befores and Afters, and as always, I'm joined by Hugo Guerra from Hugo's Desk. Hi Hugo.
Hi, how are you today, Ian? We're looking forward for this episode.
Me too. I'm really well. I'm down here in Sydney where we're still in lockdown, but things are fine. How's things in London?
Yeah, everything is kind of normal, really. Lockdown is pretty non-existent right now. The only thing we really still do is we wear masks inside shops and things, but it feels nice. Like we go out, I go to the cinema, we can go to museums. We just went to the restaurant yesterday. Just had the world's best pizza just yesterday, just around the corner of my house, which is very dangerous, but it was really good.
Oh wow, that's cool. Hugo, today we are going to be talking about a film that is an amazing visual effects film. I'm not sure if it's an amazing film, but we'll get to that. That film is 2010, the year we make contact. And then we're going to segue into a discussion about the current state of miniatures. Now, Hugo, we need to start talking about this film by quickly telling everyone that you're obsessed with this film and I had never seen it, which if the VFX supervisor Richard Edlund never finds out, he'll be really angry at me. But I just wanted to get that out there straight away to tell everyone that I haven't seen it. But this is a film that you love, right?
It is. I know. I shouldn't love this film. I know this film is terrible. It is. But I have nostalgia about it. It's came out in the middle of the 80s. I was just a kid. I was 10 years old. I think, no, I wasn't even 10 years old. I was 8 or something. And it just blew me away, just like Star Trek, the movie, did as well. I actually, for the weirdest thing is that I saw this film first before 2001. I didn't even knew the existence of 2001. Yeah, because I was a kid, you just watch whatever goes on TV. And so I was just blown away by this because at the time it looked real, Well, it still kind of does. It is mind-blowing, the visual effects, if you think about it, since it's from the 80s. It's from... What, 84, right? Is it 84? 84, right?
84, yeah.
Yeah, 84. So you see, I would have been 8. No, actually, no. Well, when it came out, Portugal is always very delayed. So when it actually came out, I was still only kind of 6 years old. But I guess I would have watched the VHS, most likely, which came out 3 years later. But I do love it. You know those kind of films that have a nostalgia place on your heart. You watch it when you're a kid, you're blown away by it, and there is nothing that anyone can say to tell you that the film is bad. There's nothing that anyone can tell me because I love the film because it's ingrained in my brain. You know what I mean, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the problem, of course, with this film, I'm sure everyone knows, it's the sequel to Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey.
Which is one of my favorite films now.
Yeah, which came out in 1968. And really, we cannot really talk about that film now because the original, because we'll spend 3 hours talking about 2001.
Yeah.
Except to say it's a masterpiece. It's ridiculously perfect.
Yeah.
It's a perfect film. And that... Obviously, while I was watching 2010 for the first time only a couple of days ago, is on your mind when you're watching 2010.
Yeah.
Right? Sorry.
It is.
I think
it's
I got that logic right.
Yeah, it is. But you imagine people at the time. They must have been
you can't not compare them. And what's interesting from my point of view is that they are really different. 2001 is mystical. You can literally watch that film 5 times and still not really know what Kubrick was on about, or Arthur C. Clarke, I guess, the author of the novel.
Yeah.
But 2010, I just want to say this up front as well, Hugo. It just explains things away to the point of being a little bit self-explanatory. Well, I mean, exposition is the main driver of the film. What's your thought on that comparison, at least, between 2001 and 2010?
Yeah, so first of all, of course, 2001 is an actual creative masterpiece, and 2010 is just a movie. That's the thing. It's just like a movie. Just like a normal, almost like borderline TV movie, And the fact that it explains so much, it's not because of the source, like it's not because of the director really. The source material is like that. Even I've read all these books, read them a long time ago, and Arthur C. Clarke is very, very upfront on the alien origin, and he's very upfront. Like if you read even 2001, it's much more self-explanatory than the film it is. Obviously, Kubrick being Kubrick, just like he did with The Shining, he's a bit like, he's making like a version of the film. He's making a creative vision, almost like you have a feeling about the book. You don't really have the book. You have the feeling that the book transmits, which leaves really into the open, the alien origin and everything. 2010 is just on your face. It just explains everything. But it's funny to read now about this film. Peter Hynes, his first reaction was not to do the movie. His first reaction was like, what, do the sequel of the best movie in the world? You must be joking. And he just said no right away. He didn't even want to do the film, which was fascinating. I think maybe he shouldn't have done the movie, but obviously, MGM was wanting to that. Like, it was only 16 years ago that they've made the first one. They wanted that sweet money. Kubrick said no right away. He just said, no way, I'm going to do a sequel. And I guess he read the script. Supposedly he read the script and he changed his mind because the script was so different from the first film. I think it's really hard for you to think about how as a director do you even try to fit the shoes of Kubrick. It's just mind-blowing, isn't it? It's weird.
Which is why I think it's different.
Yeah.
It's more like just a space story, and almost a horror space story if you want to go there. And on that level, I mean, completely watchable, partly because it's beautiful, and partly because I really like the main actor, Roy Scheider, and I really dig a few little fun things that are in there, which obviously are throwbacks to 2001. It's just that none of it is a big surprise by the time you get to the end, and even the involvement of how the AI, what do we call that? How? It just isn't. I don't know. The first film, if you were watching that in a cinema in the 60s, in the 70s, 80s, I saw it on 70mm. I'm sure a couple of years ago in Sydney, and I'd seen it on VHS, I think, before that, on DVD. It's scary. Like, I'm scared watching 2001.
Yeah.
But I wasn't scared. I didn't find it thrilling in 2010. And I think that's the general reaction to the film. It didn't do super well.
No.
Of course, it's going to be compared all the time to 2001.
It's an 80s movie.
But I think part of it is because it's not... Yeah, it's just not as compelling.
2001 is not an 60s movie. 2001 is a timeless movie, and 2010 is an 80s movie. And also, like, it's so over the top with the peace message and the Cold War message and the Soviets, and it's just too much. It makes it so timely. It makes it so, it's marking itself so much on that time that it becomes in a corner. There's no way out. Like, it's really almost like Rocky level versus Drago film. It's like the Soviets and the Americans. It spends too much time on that, I think. It really spends too much time with the Cold War, spends too much time with that feeling of conflict and that feeling of competitive that they had on the 80s, which I understand, but that's exactly the opposite. Kubrick made a film which doesn't really, it's an international movie, it doesn't really touch upon those things, and that's why it makes it so futuristic, because you do not connect to the time of today. 2010, you still connect to it because we still are ongoing with this kind of Cold War version too, so it's too dated, isn't it? That's the problem. Yeah. It's too dated.
I will say this. I would happily watch a supercut of 2010 with every establishing shot of the Russian Leonov spacecraft, when every establishing shot has a cue of music that is awesome. Some of the best music cues. I absolutely love it. I'm obsessed with it. And
That's
I'm
awesome.
sure I could go on YouTube and find that. So if there was one good takeaway from the actual film,
Yeah, no, the
it's
visuals
those
are.
cues.
But that's
Well,
why,
the visuals, yes,
the
but
visuals.
that story point, point where they establish the shots.
Yeah,
of
when
the
they
needle
always do
are
that,
amazing.
isn't it? It's amazing. It's amazing. I know what you
To
exactly
try
what you mean.
and be scary, to try and create this fear. I don't
But
know.
they really
Yeah.
transmit. I know we're getting ahead of ourselves, but they really transmit the gigantiness of Jupiter. You know, they do. They transmit that size. I think that's why it's so spectacular to watch, and I really recommend. Don't get put off. Anyone that is listening to this, don't get put off by the 80s and by the dated themes of the film. The magnitude of the imagery and display, it's like, I think it's the biggest scale I've seen in a film. Like the VFX almost look like they remind me of Interstellar because the scale is so huge. You know, it's like you're watching that planet and you feel like you're there. You know, you're actually there. You see the ship, and it's not a miniature, it's not a model, it's a ship. It really works because, you know, there's no defocusing. It's completely sharp. There's depth of field is non-existent. It's just so well crafted. I some of the best visual effects I've seen in the 80s, and I think just for that, everyone should go and watch this movie because it is a massive undertaking, as we're going to talk.
Yeah. Like I always say, I would love to have seen this film on the big screen, and part of it was because of the cinematography, which is really nice, but also I believe the way they shot miniatures, which tended to be on 65mm film.
Yeah.
For effects plates, you know, that's what they did, and it gave the highest fidelity when shooting miniature plates. The other thing is, as you mentioned, there was something about the miniatures and the lighting in space that was, I don't know, did they do this much on 2001? But it's this single source lighting used on the miniatures, right?
Yeah.
Which I feel in subsequent space films they've copied. And I think even Chris Nolan directly says that that's something he was doing on Interstellar.
Yeah.
But there is something about the harshness of it which almost looks fake, of course. But that is, of course, what's going on with the sun being a one-point light source.
Yeah.
And it's so watchable because you just feel like you're there, actually.
It's funny that you say that because everyone looks at Interstellar and even First Man and they think, oh, there's so much Kubrick on this, or there's so much Kubrick on this. I bet that it's the nostalgia playing tricks on your mind because I think what those films look like is 2010, not 2001. And I think it's because 2010 is this landmark in visual effects of space movies, but it's a landmark that very few people have watched, and it's very underrated, but everyone knows the images of it. And I think that's the thing. I think that source light, and also you've mentioned the 65mm. It's really brilliant because when you shoot on that big format, it allows you for optical compositing to have much higher quality because then you can rephotograph and because you have the 65, you still have basically you have so much more leverage to go all the way to 45, which would have been 45mm would have been the final delivery, but you have 65. That means you can blow it up, you can zoom in, you can kind of copy and do another take, which means with an optical printer you could maybe do 4 or 5 layers and then reshoot it, and then still probably reshoot it with another on top because you still had enough resolution to keep doing layers like that. And that's why it looks so good, I think, because the 65 was a perfect option for that. You know, it's it's good.
Yeah. Well, should we go back a little bit and talk about the state of play of visual effects back then? I mean, basically, the visual effects supervisor of this film was Richard Edlund.
Yeah.
Now, he had just done a stint on all 3 Star Wars films at ILM, and then he, as I understand it, came back down to LA to take over what was Donald Trumble's company, and ultimately EEG, and I think Future General was part of that mix of companies as well.
Yeah.
And Richard Edlund basically took over that company started his own studio called Boss. I don't actually know when he started calling it Boss, but suddenly found himself and his crew working on these two huge projects at the same time. One, of course, was 2010, and the other one was Ghostbusters. And I mean, it's stunning reading.
Can you believe that?
Reading that he was doing those big projects.
Yeah. Both of them at the same time, with the crew kind of like jumping around. And do you imagine like the chaos on those rooms, the chaos on the studio, trying to deliver the two biggest blockbusters of the year?
And I suppose the only thing that probably made it possible was that Ghostbusters was more of a creature show, masks and prosthetics and that sort of thing, but still miniature work. And then 2010 was heavy miniatures.
Yeah.
So I imagine it was split a bit like that. We're not going to be able to mention everyone involved, Hugo, at all.
No.
But you know, it's a huge crew, and some of the names in the crew are like people that are just so well known.
Yeah.
Today, people like Mark Stetson was heading the model shop, and he just went on to do amazing things with models.
Yeah.
Ron Gress was a texture painter, matte painter. I think Don Pennington is part of this group as well.
Yeah, yes.
And, you know, Richard Edlund, of course, just went on to be, and still is, a bit of a superstar in visual effects supervision.
Yeah.
And had already established his name with Star Wars. But, you know, the state of play, as we've mentioned, is that it's all practical effects, mostly, and we'll get to some of the digital work in a minute. But, you know, it was shooting a model on a stage, shooting elements, and then combining it in an optical printer. It blows your mind that they were able to achieve such great shots with that sort of stuff, doesn't it, Hugo?
Yeah, it does. Like this film has everything. It's like the ultimate 80s movie in visual effects. You know, it has miniatures, it has rotating sets, it has optical compositing, it has matte painting, it has blue screen. Even has like over an hour of CG animation for the screens of the Linhof and the 2000, like the actual screens, because they were all live, you know, actually playing back video sources. It's like a big VFX show today, you know, but done without a computer. So one last name that I must mention as well of this gigantic, amazing superstar crew is Sid Mid, which I had the pleasure of meeting couple of years ago at the Trojan Horse. You know, it was really nice to meet him. Of course, unfortunately, he has passed away already, but he's also part of this. It's a superstar team, definitely. It's a superstar
team. And here's the other insane thing in terms of the miniatures. So, you know, the spacecraft from 2001 is in the film. But Lore says, Lore says that Kubrick destroyed all the miniatures made for 2001.
Yeah.
And so Richard Edlund's team had to basically use a print of the film. No blueprints apparently were available. So they had to reconstruct and sort of rework out what both the monolith looked like, but also the main craft, Discovery 1. And, you know, I think that's an even bigger achievement, that they were able to redo things for the new film.
Well, there's like two stories about this. You know, I went in and tried to discover a bit about this, and the two predominating stories about Kubrick here is that the first version is that Kubrick didn't want a sequel to happen, so he actually made sure that everything was destroyed and there was no blueprints of everything, which I can kind of understand, but also I don't think it's true. That's the first version. And the second version, which I think is more true, is that MGM wasn't really wanting to pay the storage for it, because we're talking about a lot of things, and it was like 16 years of storage, and it was in bad storage, so there was like some damage as well. So at some point it got thrown away. Fascinating if you think about it, that they actually just used the print of 2001 to basically it's insane, because if you put the two films together, there's some differences. You can kind of notice some differences, but it is very faithful from the sets to the actual space, to Discovery, even how everything is very faithful. That means that they've really, it was all done by eye, just by looking at the frames of the film. They had a 70mm print, at least they could see very detailed, but even that, it would have been difficult, because on Kubrick's film, there's so much lens distortion that a lot of the edges are super defocused and super chromatic aberrated. So it must have been a pain to try to find out how this ship looked like from what, I guess, archive photos of the time, and maybe behind the scene photos that they've seen, and then the print. It's
possibly. I think it's just the print, but yeah, it's incredible. Now, Hugo, you mentioned Cinefex there. We should definitely give a shout out to that publication.
Yeah.
Their issue number 20 was an entire issue dedicated to just 2010.
Yeah.
Certainly it was something in the early days of Cinefex they did, which is cover one or just two films.
Yeah.
And the article there is this, I mean, it's just another incredible piece of journalism from Cinefex, written by Adam Eisenberg and Don Shea.
Got it here right now.
Try and get that issue if you can on eBay or on the Cinefex app. Yeah, I mean, and nothing really comes close to the way Cinefex used to cover films like this. You know, including even having an interview with one of the actors. Why am I blanking on his name? John Lithgow. Mm-hmm. You know, that's kind of cool to get his perspective on things. So definitely seek out that Cinefex. It's an incredible read. We're not going to go through it blow by blow, but it's just, you know, I guess I bring it up to mention that I really miss Cinefex already.
Yeah.
But it's fun to actually go back to watch these old films.
I know.
And then go and read the Cinefex, which is like a day job in itself. Reading, isn't it, Hugo?
This is an entire magazine. It's like 60-something pages. It's 68 pages of 2010. It's unbelievable. It's the most detailed behind the scenes I've ever seen. Not even the Blu-ray has anything. The Blu-ray has like a little small 7-minute long making off behind the scenes at the time, you know. So there's not even any love on that sense. Maybe someday there will be like a Criteria edition. If Criteria ever listens to this, please make one. I'll help. If you need any help, we'll make one.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've talked a little bit about the miniatures, but as you mentioned, one of the cool things about, say, you mentioned moving sets, but even with the miniatures, the Leonov has that middle section which rotates, and if you read the Cinefex, there's a great material about how they rigged that so that could happen. And then when they first encounter the Discovery 1, it's rotating on its center axis, and that's also fascinating how they rigged that to do that. So again, I don't want to try and go into the weeds of the details there, Hugo, but just from a miniatures point of view, I enjoyed watching that on the screen, seeing those kind of movement in miniatures, in models. Yeah.
Which I think it's like, it's one of the first times where we see, because you see, Peter Hyams really wanted this to be real, you know, because remember on the 80s we already had, it's not like 2001. In 2001, no one knew how space looked like, you know, so it was a bit not easier. And I don't want to say it's easy, but would be easier because it was more to the imagination. But at this time, in 84, we already had the Voyager trips sending photos to Earth. You know, NASA was at full swing. We had even like the space shuttle program. People already kind of knew how space looked like. You know, there were satellites all the time. So it's really cool that Peter Hyams, the director, really wanted to convey this realism. And I think you can kind of really tell that because these miniatures stay on screen for a long time. Like we're talking about like slow pans, really slow shots of the ship just passing through. You can kind of see the rotation of Leonov, like you say. You see them both on the same screen at the same time as well, which is remarkable. They've actually comped. They've actually have the two miniatures on one single shot, sometimes attached to each other, sometimes separated. We really linger on these shots to a point that there's no way to hide, you know, because normally visual effects at this time, it would have been a short shot, like if you look at Star Wars, everything is really short and everything is like montage, almost like an action movie, of a modern action movie. This is not like that. This is almost like a documentary, almost like watching NASA TV live, because they sometimes spend like a minute on one of these shots. It's unbelievable the amount of care that you had to do to rig this so that you wouldn't see the rigs, you wouldn't see the wires, the lighting had to be on point, and then of course all the painting they had to do on optical printing. Like, it's very impressive.
Before we started talking, I wondered whether any of these miniatures were around in terms of collectors. Yeah. And there are some Hollywood auctions that tend to happen, places like Prop Store and something called Profiles in History. I did find an entry for the Leonov, Profiles in History auction from, I think it was 2018. I can't remember how many versions of that miniature were made, but this was a 139 by 60 by 48 inch version that didn't apparently sell at the auction, but that they were advertising for between $20,000 and $30,000 US.
Oh wow!
So Hugo, listen, if it comes up again, you and I are going to go in on that, right?
We're going to buy it. Yeah. I hope it's not the original, because the original was 12 foot. That one does not fit my house. But yeah, they made, like, for the cinematography, they made two main versions with every little bell and whistle. The 12-foot version, they had a 6-foot version as well, so that they could attach it to the Discovery. But both of them were fully functioning with the rotating thing, and also with the parachute as well. They had to make one with the big ass parachute. No, we're gonna buy that, Ian. Yeah, we're gonna. Then I guess we need to decide. We're gonna just keep it like 1 year it's on my house and another year it's on your house.
Totally done. Done deal.
We can convert it to a fridge, and the rotation thing can just like have the booze going around. I'm joking.
Yeah. Can we also talk about, in terms of the miniatures, that amazing, as when they connect the Leonov to the Discovery, the amazing kind of wire bridge kind of docking thing, but it's not really a docking thing. That's one piece of imagery I had remembered from years and years of the film being out before actually watching it, and then to see the behind the scenes shots in Cinefex and elsewhere of like that, of course, is miniature photography and matte paintings. I just love that. It's such a cool little thing about how to get from one ship to the other, right? It's actually pretty cool.
It is, yeah, it is. But it's also like so realistic. That's why I like the film so much, because everything, the film is a bad movie, but everything around it's so well constructed in terms of realism. I guess it kind of makes sense, since Sid Mead was so involved. He is a industrial designer from heart, so it makes sense, because he's building everything in a way that it would have been real. Like if you look at the Leonov, everything looks very practical. Everything looks like a spaceship would have looked like if they would actually make one. And that's why that wire transportation thing looks so realistic, because you think, yeah, probably NASA would have done that if they had the stuff at the time, which makes a lot of sense. That's why the film looks so real in every sense. I think because they brought in that kind of speciality thinking, the industrial designer thinking, so it's not just aesthetic. This was not a fantasy movie at all. Like, it's not like Star Wars and in a sense Star Trek as well. It's really like an industrial film, almost like they had like NASA making these ships or something. That was very interesting.
Yeah. Another thing that I thought played into that realism were the spacewalks.
Yeah.
They were also successful in 2001. There was something about the photography that looked good, and this time, again, I think it's that single source lighting that was decided upon. Yeah. But there's an interesting story with that, Hugo, isn't there? Deciding to do single source lighting means that any kind of blue screen photography was going to be possibly problematic.
Yeah. There was a lot of talks on that, and you can kind of see that on the film, like on some shots, unfortunately, especially when you watch like a Blu-ray version, a crisp Blu-ray. I watched it on my projector, and You do see the masks around some shots. Unfortunately, you do see the black levels are not completely merged. Only on some shots, though. I think it's only a few. So it's really remarkable that they have actually achieved photorealism on some other shots. But yeah. Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. The source lighting must have been a huge problem because remember, there's no nuke, you know. You can't just like rotoscope and use nuke to comp this together, you know.
Well, what I read about this as well was that usually if you're shooting a person in a spacesuit against a blue screen for, you know, space photography, especially back then, yes, you had a key light, but you would also need a fill to suppress any of the blue screen spill. And so because Peter Hyams only wanted one source, apparently Richard Edlund had to come up with an adaptation of a different process that had been developed elsewhere. He named it Blue Flux.
Yeah.
And I think it was basically front projection blue screen.
Yeah.
Now, again, I don't want to stuff it up about how this actually works, so you've got to go and read the Cinefex. But, you know, here's an example of, all right, we've got to come up with a way to solve this director's aesthetic with the technology we have at the time. And I think it was just one example of really solving something to make it look pretty cool. Yes, in 2021 standards, we're going to notice it.
Yeah, of course.
But the mix of live action actors doing the spacewalks, there's some miniatures of like figurines as well.
Yeah, especially
used.
on the very wide shots, you can kind of tell that even if you watch it on a big projector. They use miniatures of the people, but it's fascinating you're talking about the photography. One thing I didn't mention from the beginning is that Peter Hyams, the director, was also the director of photography on this film. It's very unusual to have directors involved directly on the directing of photography. That was unusual to see, but the film does look beautiful. I think he did a great job, even the interior shots as well. But that must have been tough to do both jobs at the same time, you know, like, because this is not, there's no there's no playbacks, you know, this is like film. There's no video village here. You can't just like look at a shot and then look at it. You have to wait for next day to watch they have to process, and then they watch it, and then, well, maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. It's really fascinating.
As you say, it benefited from moon landings, NASA stuff, space shuttle footage, you know, stuff. And that goes as well for actually how Jupiter looked, didn't it? Because we were seeing great imagery or NASA imagery of Jupiter. But I can't imagine in 1982, 83, before the film came out, how they imagined they could do Jupiter. Like, I guess they thought of map paintings because that was the way space was done. Yeah. But Hugo, here they tried something new, right? In relation to CG.
They did, yeah. So before I say this, there's another thing that comes to mind from the nostalgia factor here. I don't know if you remember this when you were younger, but when I was a kid, I was obsessed by the Voyager's photos and footage, and there was even like some TV shows where you would had like a CG version of the Voyager traveling through the planets, and then they would be cut away with the real photos. I think those CG scenes were probably one of the reasons I'm doing visual effects these days, because they've blown me away. But back then they looked photoreal. They really blowed me away. But yeah, they tried. This film was really ahead of its time. For Jupiter, they actually tried very hard to do this entire thing in a computer, you know, like on a super. It's so funny to read Cinefex, isn't it? Because like a supercomputer that can handle 2,000 words. It's like it's such a different way of talking about computers and hardwares. They don't ever talk about the CPU or the memory because those concepts are very alien. But yeah, they tried. Well, there were so many attempts, man. They first tried. They first thought they could use the real photos. Voyager was going around Jupiter so many times that they actually had really, really high resolution photos of all the cloud system. And they thought, oh, maybe we can interpolate between the frames, maybe we can like fix the deviation between frames and the shakes and all the flickers and all the lighting intensities. The problem is, like, we're talking about like 1984. There's no nuke or shake or fusion to fix these things. You can't really like fix this in compositing, because compositing was like, digital compositing existed, but it was kind of like it was kind of like a concept, really, not much more than that. So that didn't kind of work. And they did do an experiment that was successful, which was done in 35mm with the video version. They did manage to do that, didn't they? Like, but it also kind of had some issues. Yeah. So it was
just on that, Hugo.
Yeah.
We should give a shout out to the company, because it was a game-changing company, Digital Productions.
Yeah.
And John Whitney Jr. and others who had been doing computer-generated imagery. And successfully, but clearly it just wasn't high res enough. That almost, the fidelity was almost the only reason they didn't do it.
It's because they didn't hold up to the 65. That's the thing. They didn't hold up to the 65mm. But even if you tried.
Yeah, as I understand it, as you say, some of the tests worked and could be used for playback, and could inform, the ultimate result. But sorry, keep going with the different methods that they used, because they did so many.
They spent like you see them talking about this like as it was the longest thing on the production. They spent so much time trying to, because you need to, like, this was just the brink of visual effects becoming computerized, and I think it was just a couple of more. I mean, in a couple of years from this film, you would have started having Pixar putting out some shorts. You would have started having a couple of things coming out. So it was almost there. I guess almost like they made the film maybe 3-4 years too soon. If they would have done it maybe in 88 or maybe on 90, they would have probably managed to do it in the computer. Because on the 90s, early 90s, you start seeing quite a lot. But yeah, nothing worked. The interpolation didn't work. The photos didn't work. And in the end, it was so strange, because they ended up like having these enormous sheets of the photos, and then they paint over on top of them by hand. It's just unbelievable.
which they referred to as what was it? Snake trails or something like that?
No, snake skin prints.
Snake skin.
Yeah, skin. Which is like the all these rolls of the massive cloud system. But you saw also the details that they've actually used computers to simulate and to actually find out the actual liquid movement. Movement for the simulation. Yeah. This must have been, I guess this is one for your VFX First podcast, must have been one of the first simulations, not simulation, because they've simulated it but they didn't produce any image, but they did simulate. Yeah. It's almost like a Houdini simulation without rendering it.
Yeah.
It was really funny.
It's an interesting thing to highlight, because look, the film is a huge visual effects film. It was nominated for an Oscar.
Yeah.
Visual effects Oscar. And every visual effects aficionado knows about it. But it's interesting, Hugo. If this film was a lot more successful, had been a lot more successful, I guarantee you some of the methodologies, the visual effects methodologies in there, would have been talked about more and would have perhaps become more commonplace more quickly. The truth is, there weren't that many big visual effects studios doing stuff. It was kind of like EEG, Boss, ILM, Apogee, and a bunch of practical effects places. But that's it, right?
Yeah.
People are going to totally comment and say, what about this? What about that? Well, of course, I'm missing out on some. But it people knew how this was done, and also Cinefex, documented it so well. I'm just saying, I wonder what would have happened if this film was like a huge blockbuster success.
Yeah.
I feel like the visual effects would have been grasped onto more and talked about more.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. Because some of these techniques were groundbreaking. This visual effects attempt of doing a CG Jupiter was groundbreaking, and they probably would have invested more money in this equipment. They even talk about like using like really prototype versions of recorders. They use really high-end supercomputers that were never used. This is really groundbreaking stuff, to a point that they even got Sony involved to get hold of like the special recorder they're using from stop motion would allow them to record so much faster. So it was it's fascinating what you're saying. I never thought about that.
I just mean that maybe some other studios might have adopted that
some of the techniques,
CG. Yeah. Look, leaps and bounds happened in the years after this film. I mean, I can't remember exactly what year it came out, but the young Sherlock Holmes with an ILM.
It was 87, I think. It was 87, so it was a few years later. Yeah.
It might have been before that, but things were happening.
Yeah.
And of course the 80s and then the 90s were huge visual effects things. I just watched this film recently and thought, oh my God, how come we didn't see a billion other films like this or with these techniques? And I don't know if this theory is right, but it just feels like because it was a smaller result in terms of who saw it.
Yeah.
Look, the same thing can be said for Dune, which came out only a couple of weeks later, right?
Yeah, it was.
An incredible effects film. It just, and Blade Runner, later, these films weren't as big as Star Wars or E.T. or Indiana Jones.
No.
And so they just don't quite fit into both the cultural discussion, but probably even the effects discussion. And I'm so glad we're talking about it today.
Yeah. There's one thing we need to still talk about just to wrap it up. The miniatures at the end, I thought that they were fascinating. The Europa miniatures and the actual planet miniatures.
Yeah.
Those miniatures were fascinating, to a point that they went into really big leaps, especially to the Europa final miniatures, where you see the monolith and you see the planet being grown as a planet with forests and trees and fog and everything. They actually did this massive set with fog, and they actually had to rig the sky to the same rig as the camera, so that when they move the camera, the sky would move with the camera. And this was just because the scale would have been off if the sky would just been a matte painting on the behind the matte painting. And then the camera would move, then you would have seen the trees move as quickly as the sky. So they did this massive rig so that the sky would move at the same time. I thought that was amazing. It was fascinating.
Yeah.
That entire
what does that
rig.
remind you of? That reminds you, of course, of the Fullstrom stuff that's happening with virtual production and LED walls right now.
It's
right?
exactly like that. It's exactly like that. But it was that set, that final set, not just the final set on Europa, but also on the beginning of the film when they send the probe to the planet, to the icy planet. All those shoots look so real, don't they? Like the miniature versions of those planets. They look so real.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because my obsession in visual effects, which I rarely get to cover, is tabletop miniatures.
Yeah.
And that's basically what you're talking about there,
Yeah.
especially with the monolith placed there. My desire is that somehow tabletop miniatures can be kept and, bought and removed to my house. But of course, it's never possible. They're always
minus the
stripped back and
minus the toxic materials.
Oh, they often talk about that, don't they? For dust and smoke.
Yes, minus the toxic materials. I know exactly what you mean. When I was a kid, I was obsessed by these miniatures that I used to see on commercials of toys. You know that? Like you would see like the G.I. Joe toys, you would see the Transformer toys, you would see the train toys, and then you would get the toy. Where's the rest? Where's the grass? Where's the buildings? Where's the rest of the miniature that I see on the? That is always. I'm like playing with my G.I. Joe, but I want the terrain that they made for the commercial. I don't want just the G.I. Joe.
They're always incredible studies in dressing to camera, because of course there are brilliant miniature creators out there doing railroads and things like that, right, in their backyards or garages. But visual effects practitioners, they're building these miniatures just to be seen by the camera, and that is just a different kind of way of thinking, which is one reason I love tabletop miniatures.
Yeah, exactly.
Hugo, because you brought up an extra thing, I think I also forgot to mention the Star Child puppet.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Now, again, maybe we just talk briefly about this. In Cinefex, they mentioned there was actually, a quite disastrous attempt to do it at first. And then, attempts involving getting the thing to blink, and does it actually blink in the end on the film? Don't think it does.
I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
It's a thing where I believe they ended up using gelatin to do it. This is pre-silicon days, but it does look better than the 1968 version, which is, as I understand, fiberglass or something else. So really successful in the end, but apparently a real pain to do, this Star Child puppet.
I didn't even thought about that until I read it. Like it's so funny because we're so used to now CG and have subsurface scattering, and these guys were making subsurface scattering by hand, like using gelatin and layers of gelatin, trying to make the skin. It's very successful. Yes, obviously. When you look back, it would have been so much easier to do it in silicon, and even easier to do it in CG, of course. But it is less creepy than the one in Kubrick's film, and it's much more well achieved, I think, on screen. But there was a lot of shots that were supposed to be on the film that never really came in. I think maybe some of them got lost on the editorial. I think at some point, probably Peter Hyams probably didn't want to use as much, but they did film a lot of it, but never really came into the film. There's no behind the scenes. There's no real cut shots or deleted scenes for us to watch, which is a shame. But they did film a lot, but didn't use much. That would be the case,
Well, everyone go and watch the film, then read the Cinefex, and listen to this podcast. But we're gonna now, because I think we just love the miniature work on 2010 so much.
Yeah.
We thought, Hugo, didn't we, that it would be an interesting discussion to see where miniatures are still used and still not used in visual effects, because many people refer to it as a dying art. I think it comes in waves. It feels like sometimes miniatures have died, then they have a resurgence, and then they die again. And I'm not sure where we're at in that arc. Or in that graph, but I still wanted to talk about them because I certainly still love them, and I love them where they work, and I love pointing out ones that don't work as well. But what's your general take on miniatures at the moment, Hugo?
I think it's like you said. It is, let's be honest, it is like, of course, a dying art, since there's so many companies that have closed and so few companies that actually are doing it right now. And obviously the push for them are coming from certain directors, like if you think about it, obviously like Christopher Nolan has been doing miniatures for the beginning, since he started doing films. But he also is still only doing film in IMAX and only doing film in actual celluloid film. So it is more of the old school directors and the old school films that are actually using it. But we were... By looking at this, because I've always loved miniatures as well, and I've even done projects with miniatures, but when we started investigating for this podcast, we actually found out that there are actually quite a lot of films that are still using it for some reason or the other. For me, like, miniatures still really work really well, and I think they are an amazing alternative to CG because you get so much out of them. Like, they are physical, obviously, and they have so much detail, and obviously I know that sometimes they don't work, but they give you so much on camera, even sometimes to just use them as a reference. I feel like that they have huge advantages to be done. And sometimes, let's face it, I've done so many CG projects, it's not like CG is that cheap. I think people have that impression that, we'll just do it in CG. But if you have the correct people, I really strongly believe that if you have the correct people and you have the correct film and the correct story trying to use miniatures to its best, I guess it's a bit like the other conversations we had on this podcast. I am an old school person. I'm sure people already understood this by just listening to me. I do feel that just the same way with the 2D animation that we were having discussion with the stylization, I feel like sometimes people just abandon things right away to go to the shiny new toy, and then they never really try to integrate it or try to think about it or try to still use certain parts that were actually good. And now, with compositing, they are definitely worth doing, because you can, as we're going to see with some of the examples we brought, do you imagine like anything that you can film now with the advent of advanced compositing like Nuke and Flame and Fusion and Shake? Like, you can literally clean up anything. You can clean up wires, you can clean up rigs, you can really merge rigs, you can use motion control to a different level. So these days I feel like with compositing, with good compositors and good rotoscoping, you could actually do photorealistic miniatures to a level that 2010 could even dream of, you know. Like, I that's my point. I am expecting it to happen soon, a film that is really going to push the miniatures thing, because compositing is right there. Mean, it's happening, I know.
I think you could say Interstellar is that film where miniatures were combined with digital visual effects to either composite them into digital backgrounds or real backgrounds, to use digital ships as well as miniature ones. And if no one told us which was which, we might not know. Look, the more recent example, which doesn't have a billion miniatures in it but has really cool ones, is the Mandalorian. Right? This is the way ILM has used a miniature version of the Razor Crest, and in season 2 the Moff Gideon's light cruiser. Now, I'm not sure how many shots they end up being in, but it's quite a number, and I honestly don't think people would know. No. But as you say, Hugo, the coolest thing is they had a practical thing to use as reference for a benchmark. They had a practical thing to see what lighting did when it hit the panels of the Razor Crest. They had a thing where they shot it and it's there ready to go. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't take months and months to do.
Of course.
And it suffers from the challenge that all miniatures suffer from, which is once you've built it, you're, I'm going to say, stuck with it, which is not quite true, because of course it can be fiddled with in CG. But that is a challenge that is probably why many producers and directors don't love miniatures. Because you build them and they can't be changed.
Well, but
the Mandalorian is the one.
But you see, like, I personally like that as a director. I like to commit to something, and I feel like sometimes films don't commit enough, and they don't commit to a vision, and having a miniature really forces you to commit to a vision, like they did there on The Mandalorian. It's really funny to see the Mandalorian documentary. I really advise everyone to go and see. There's like a video behind the scenes of how they made this, and which I think it was also the intent. The intent was to make this a thing, to make a documentary out of it, and to make like a big thing of the coming together of all these ILM people, the old school with the new school, and trying to do this Razor Crest model. I mean, they even showed it on the Star Wars Celebration, didn't they? As a thing, as a thing. I
just to jump in there, I did do an interview, which I will put a show note link on, where John Knoll, who devised the motion control side of shooting that Razor Crest, said that sure, he had been doing a motion control rig for a while apparently, but he said it was partly budgetary. Hey, we've got all these CG shots, maybe we should build a miniature, because once we've built it, we can use it, and
we can scan
it. The Mandalorian doesn't have all the money in the world.
No,
I mean, they spend a lot of money on the virtual production side as well. But so I agree with you. I think that the broadcasting of the fact that they were using old school methods was a big thing. Or at least became a big thing.
It did, yeah. I mean, they made a big thing on the Disney, on this Star Wars Celebration. They even presented it to a huge crowd, which had the standing ovation and everything. But it was really interesting to see it, because they got so much out of this. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, man, I know exactly how the reflections work. I know exactly what the little details of the ship are. And it gets that grittiness that you would not normally get on a model, because normally when you do it in CG, everything is very clean, and it goes through so many phases of people and so many departments that it sometimes gets highly sanitized, So doing a miniature sometimes for me, it feels like doing concept art, because it's a vision of one person. And you can see on the documentary of the Razor Crest model that literally there was, like they used a lot of 3D printing, but literally there was one person constructing this thing.
Yeah.
And so his artistry was really in the ship. The Razor Crest model just proves the point that you don't need to do it all in CG, but it also helps the production as well to visualize everything, before the CG is there. So I love this merging. I love that there are shots with it and shots without it. I just find it fascinating,
Yeah, and the merging, as you say, Hugo, is not just in whether it's a final CG shot or a miniature composite. It's the actual getting to the process because, as you say, 3D printing means that you really have to model the thing first, then
in 3D,
print it, and then let the 3D thing you build, the model, inform the final CG model.
Yeah.
This is something that happens regularly with stop motion animation now.
Yeah.
And the reason I did air quotes is because, to my mind, stop motion has kind of become a bit of a CG hybrid game.
It has,
especially by studios like Laika, which, have probably just as much CG in them as puppets and stop motion now. But deliberately.
Yeah.
Right? Like they're trying to get the best thing on screen, and their puppets are built as CG models, 3D printed, and then they're actually CG characters in the films. So
merged and composite together. Yeah.
And so the new miniatures might be...
Oh, they definitely are. Yeah. They're definitely there,
motion.
Especially if you look at Wes Anderson's movies. And yeah, definitely are. Ian, I completely agree with you. And I can see the future. I can see an episode of VFX Notes about this. Because I definitely think that really deserves an episode, because some of the miniature work that you've seen lately on, especially, like you said, Laika, but also Wes Anderson movies and some other films, is really the perfect combination of all these things. And they're really using all the technology they can find, old,
motion
new,
control,
anything they can find, the new stuff, the old stuff. They just put the kitchen sink on it, and it just produces an amazing looking film with a lot of artistic input, just like a concept art does, that has like really you can feel on the drawing the artist's look and feel, and I think that's a fascinating topic. But anyway, I promise that we'll talk about that more. But
okay.
One thing, before we venture into more modern things, I wanted to give a shout out. I know that this is an old movie. I understand. Well, old movie to different standards, but I really wanted to give a shout to Moon. Like a really small production that happened. I think it's like 12 years old now, isn't it? 12 years old, something like that.
Yep.
And that film, for me, has some of the best forced perspective in miniatures work that I've ever seen, which is funny because, they used like miniatures on the rovers, they used miniatures on the Harvester, they used miniatures on the moon. Obviously, there's a lot of CG and a lot of compositing done by Cinesite there, like they especially have with the two actors. I don't want to spoil the film, and of course the CG arm of the robot, which was supposed to be done practical, but then it didn't work, and then they did a mix and did the CG and not CG, which is really fascinating. But the miniature work on that film really proves the point. On that time, it was more expensive to do it in CG than it was on miniatures, and the miniatures have such a stylized look to them with the sources of light and also the silhouetted, the grittiness, the dirt, all those little things. The film looks just stunning, and most people watching these days, they probably think it's all CG. They probably do. I find that film fascinating, almost like a time capsule of what miniatures can do, because this is like 10 years ago. There was already enough technology to do it in full CG, but there was just like a monetary constraint there, and there was a budget constraint. But I also find it fascinating that Duncan actually made decisions right there and made the miniatures. It really speaks to he's such a good director. You can kind of feel that he has a vision, and I just wanted to shout out that because I think that's a beautiful film.
I would add that there is something about where those miniatures were, which was a lunar surface that you can replicate on a tabletop miniature, and you can have that one source lighting, that it suited miniatures. And that's not like saying they shouldn't have done it or should have done it. It just suits miniatures, and you can get that kind of forced perspective look. But also, there is something about this film, Hugo, and I love Moon. There are probably less shots in there than we remember. If that makes sense.
There is.
They're used sparingly. Now, that's a very interesting thing because it means you feel like there's more in there. There's more production value. Yeah. There's more going on. But actually, so much of that film is inside with the actor.
Yeah.
Or actors. I love the spoiler that you didn't give.
Well, I didn't want to
no, it's good.
Because if someone hasn't watched it, they should go and watch it because it's going to spoil the film.
I love Moon's Miniatures, and I think Bill Pearson was someone behind it, but it was a bit of a group that came together to do that. And great that you shouted it
But
out.
I know it's really old, and I know it's not really relevant to the conversation because we're talking about the stuff that is happening now, and so let's just continue discussing that. Yeah.
So Hugo, the couple of films I think we definitely need to shout out that are pretty recent, where miniatures played a key role. One of them is First Man, a beautiful film about the moon landing, which I didn't think it did that well, but had some incredible miniatures overseen by Ian Hunter and then combined with Dean Egg visual effects. There was a real practical effects but also optical side of the visual effects work that I just loved. Again, with the whole 1-point source lighting, and just really worked. Chris Nolan's films, we've already mentioned a little bit, Interstellar, but also Tenet, used some miniature buildings for explosion at the end. I thought they were cool. Dunkirk, I was surprised when I covered the film that there were miniature airplanes.
You're going too fast. Like there, you see, like the audience now is probably getting aware that there is actually quite a lot of films that you're using miniatures lately. Because that was my surprise when we started thinking and debating about this. There's actually a lot, Yes, First Man, like you said, it has the miniatures on the docking station, and there's a lot of compositing merging with the original archive footage, and there's miniatures with LED screens as well. There's miniatures that are actually there, but then extended in CG. So there's a huge practical element to them that then DNEC could just extend that miniature and make the rest of the CG that was missing. Of course, removing all the rigs as well. The film is astonishing. Yes, the film didn't do well, but I think the film is going to live the test of time. I think the film is going to become a cult because it is.
Yeah, I loved it.
The film is amazing, and the film is hypnotic. Every time it's on TV, I just have to watch it until the end. It's a really long film, but it's like really, it hypnotizes you the way that it's so well crafted and so well filmed. But I feel like, and it wasn't the Oscar, and I think it really deserved that Oscar, man. The visual effects combined with optical miniatures just looked stunning. But again, you see, the old school thing. This director is very old school. He's also only shoots in film. He's even on La La Land, he does a lot of tricks with the camera, with optical cameras. Like, he does a lot of work with wires. He is also this kind of old guard of Hollywood, of Tarantino, of Christopher Nolan, in some way also maybe a little bit of Ridley Scott sometimes as well, but only sometimes. But so there's like this old vanguard of directors that do this kind of work. Okay,
but here we go. Here's where the debate happens.
Yeah.
Could they have done those spaceship shots in CG?
They could.
And done it really well. Let's put it out there, Framestore did a ridiculously insane job with gravity, and we all believe that work, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I want to be careful, Hugo.
I know.
That we're not saying, oh, just because you choose to use miniatures and it's old school, you're doing a better thing. Or it's the right way to do it.
No, not at all.
We just sort of, yeah, I know you're not necessarily saying that, but
I'm glad
argument
that you're
does
saying
happen.
That. Yeah, I'm glad you're saying that because I don't want it to have any misunderstandings of my words. I just feel that it really worked for these films and for the vision that they were trying to go for. Obviously, you can do it all in CG. Right now, you can. There's no... Yes, Gravity is quite old already. Like, Gravity already proved that you can definitely do it. But I also, from a director point of view, since I'm a director as well, I understand sometimes why some of these films are done with miniatures to begin with, because I mean, I guess it's a bit like the Unreal thing with the volume, isn't it? Nothing beats seeing something for real. Nothing beats that. Like, you're there on the set and there's something in front of you, or you're actually inside of it, or you can kind of see the miniatures. It just gives a different notion. You can kind of rework your camera. That's one of the biggest frustrations I have as a director. The biggest frustrations is that when I'm doing a full CG project, it takes so long to even view a camera, because when I'm on set, I put the camera, put the viewfinder, look at it. Okay, I don't like this. Let's switch the lens. Oh, let's put the camera on the left. Let's put the camera on the right. Let's just try this. In CG, you say, okay, I want a 24 mil. And then 1 week later, you get a frame after it went through a lot of departments. And then you look at it like, needs to be a 30. Oh, 30. Okay, next week we'll send you another one. And it's all just really, for me personally, it's all very slow and frustrating. And it becomes, from a creative point of view, very taxing, because incredibly difficult to try to find out how it would work. So for me, I'm a hands-on director, so I do love the fact that with a miniature I can at least viewfind it, even if I'm only going to use the miniature as a reference. That's fine. I can use it as a reference later on. But I love the fact that I can make creative choices in the moment and just try a few things, because it's really difficult to try things in CG. That's the problem, you know? Which I understand.
It's interesting you say that, though, because, of course, miniatures take months to build.
I know, no, but I'm not talking about the actual structure. I mean, obviously I understand that, and that goes through the phases of concept art and drawing. Once it's built, that's what I mean, like positioning the camera and looking how it looks, and that's what I mean. I'm not talking about the actual aspect of the miniature itself, because that is also, like, as you're going to talk on Blade Runner, a lot of times they do the miniature and then it doesn't work, and then they have to do it in full CG anyway. So I don't know. This is a conflict. I understand that it's, for some people, it's ridiculous what I'm saying, but if anyone listening has ever directed something, I think you can understand what I'm coming from. Where when you're directing there on set, it's just easier to see it for real, and I think that's why people love volume so much, because you can just see it and make decisions right away. Sometimes CG, as fast as it become now with real time and also with really fast render farms, it's sometimes not fast enough for you to kind of try things. But, this is a segue. I'm just like giving a personal view on that. It's not even part of the, discussing that.
Yeah. The film you mentioned, Blade Runner 2049, this was a film that Weta Workshop did some awesome things for Future LA. And also the Trash Mesa.
Yeah.
I loved what they came up with from a production design and also just miniature build point of view for LA. It was clearly just part of the process of filling out that future world.
Yeah.
But because they could shoot those miniatures in smoke and start building up a world, I mean, it clearly informed the final shots. And, they can run a camera through it as if it's a spacecraft or a spinner, going through it. As you keep saying, there's a real benefit to having it there.
There's a tactical feeling. And on that film, they've actually ended up using there's one shot on the film which is from the miniatures, obviously with a lot of extensions and a lot of extra shenanigans in CG, obviously. Not denying that. It has a lot of treatment on top. But LAPD building is one of the few shots on the film that survived from the original motion control shoot, and then they just like added things on top. But it's really lovely how you see that they are actually, you know, for those of you that know CG, you know that we render AOVs, you know, we render the speculars and the highlights, we render all the separate layers so that we can build it together and then tweak it. They did that with the motion control. It was beautiful. You know, they had like a silhouetted version. They had a fog version. They had like just one with just the lights on, the one without the lights, the one with light from the left, the one with light from the right. They could just pass all these things on the motion control and then rebuild it all in compositing with like these 10, 15 layers. And I really understand how fascinating that is to build. And I'm sure that sequence then became the benchmark for everything else. You know, it became, okay, this is what we're aiming for, even if it doesn't look really, really perfect. It looks very close to the original Blade Runner, and now the CG team has a reference to strike for. And then I'm obviously thinking the CG most likely looked even better because that thing existed. You know, I think it connects. It really connects. And I like this idea of doing at least one practical shot and then everything else can then be CG around it. I mean, a bit like First Man, a bit like Interstellar. They've done that as well over there. But yeah, on Blade Runner does have, it gives a lot of grit and realism. It gives all these little small flaws that you see when you're filming something practical. I completely get it. You know, I myself did exactly the same thing on a trailer that I directed a few years ago for Vermintide 2 from Warhammer. And we did the same as well. We did a miniature shoot, and we also did the motion control, and we did multiple passes, you know, with the fog pass and the light pass. And because that project was so low budget, it really allowed us to do all those passes, and then we comped them all together. It really gave a lot of freedom in the compositing for us to fiddle around. But obviously, like you say, once it's shot, it's shot. You can't really change it much unless you're going to replace it full CG. But it's funny that you're talking about the other shots, not the LAPD building, but the other one, the garbage shot. What was the name of that place? I can't remember the name of the place, but that was supposed to be a miniature, wasn't it, Ian? It was supposed to all be done in miniatures as well. But that did not work out. Well, I think when a workshop...
Yeah, I think they built a miniature set for that to be, you know, background plates for the spinner coming in and crashing. But, you know, in some ways that sequence was made bigger because it's meant to sort of be a bit of a surprise that he gets shot down. Yeah. I'm curious about the weather situations there. I seem to remember it was raining. It's always raining in Blade Runner. I don't know too many details about the original build and what, you know, I know Framestore ended up doing that completely CG.
Yeah.
But all we can say really is that any different than building a set at Pinewood and it not working, or designing a set?
Yeah.
You know, and then it getting redesigned. I mean, it's hard to tear down a set, I suppose, but it does happen.
Yeah.
There's, you know, there are things that work and don't work. Sometimes it's a bit of a proof of concept. Maybe the fact that a miniature wasn't used is actually a good thing because it doesn't cost the same as building it out in the back lot, right? Or building, you know, they didn't build the whole CG thing and then change it. Again, I'm sure it was great reference. The only thing I reckon maybe that it reminds me of sometimes is that, and I don't know if this was the case with the Trash Mesa, was scale.
Yeah.
So clearly, miniature is smaller. So you have to position your camera, you have to do clever things with forced perspective and other things. And we all know water is a big problem in miniature.
Yeah.
Maybe because this was an aerial shot of the spinner coming in, maybe scale was the tricky bit.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't know that for sure. But I imagine that's when we've seen miniatures over the years from like 40s and 50s films and 60s films.
Oh yeah, Superman, for example. Look at Superman's miniatures. They look they look minuscule, don't they? They look so small.
Do, yeah.
On the first Superman from Richard Donner. It's really remarkable. No, but I think I guess it again goes back to whatever we keep saying on this show when we're talking about old school. Whatever works to make something look better, and on some situations it's better to do the old school version, and others it doesn't. Like a great example of that is Tenet, with that explosion scale 1/3 building. You know, the two buildings that explode, the one that implodes and then the other one that explodes. It's a really remarkable version that they've actually done it with miniatures, but then we also know that they've done it in CG on the same exact shot right next to it. So it's really, you know, I don't know, like which I can't. There's no reason for me to say what's best and what's not best. I just love this merging of technology. I love this idea of doing both. You know.
Yeah, I mean, put it this way: Dean Egg could easily have done a Houdini,
of course,
and did for that building
for other shots
to supplement. And to supplement that shot.
Yeah.
In the same way that the full scale plane crash, which is just a plane hitting a building, that could have been a miniature, and it could have been a CG plane. Yeah. But actually, if you watch the behind the scenes and blah blah blah, Chris Nolan and other people say, well, it was almost cheaper to buy a plane and do it.
Yeah.
You know, but again, he's like, well, if we could do it for real, we're going to have a camera there.
Yeah.
We'll try it. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
But I am definitely going to say there are probably scenes in films where I could say to someone, hey, that's a miniature. And they'll go, wow, I love that. Love the practical. And then I'll go, oh, sorry, I was lying. It's fully CG. I mean, it's just the truth, right? Like, it's Baby Yoda thing.
Exactly, it's the Baby Yoda thing. It is. I think people... It's the same thing with Solo, with this underwater explosion, that they've could have done it all in simulation, but they've used parts of that underwater tank explosion. They've used parts, and it worked really lovely. I feel like sometimes on these new productions, I really wish that everyone would at least try to shoot for real first, see if it works out, and then augment it and extend it and do whatever they can to hide certain things and try. Because I think that was one of the things we suffered in the year 2000s, you know, when we had a lot of really bad CG films that are still today haunting us because of that. Because a lot of times people just did a blue screen, or they just did it fully in the computer without even any connection to anything. And I just feel that when you have a practical shot to begin with, it's a great way to start the shot, so that you at least have a camera there, at least you have some elements. And you notice that even in, not just in miniature work, but even on CG work, you still have huge amounts of the set that are built, and then you have extensions. I just feel that it works better. You know, it's also easier for everyone in the production to understand what's trying to aim for, you know. So I like that. I like that idea.
And then there is some miniature stuff. I'm going to at least mention one film where I love that they use miniatures to try and tap into a bit of a stylized thing or a period thing. The film I'm thinking of is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Quentin Tarantino's film, where very fleeting uses of some miniatures, including a 747 shot in amongst the clouds. I mean, that's a miniature shot. Because it just works. It's kind of like a 70s film, as in 70s film look is what I'm getting at. And then there's also some miniatures work just for I think it's like a drive-in shot where, you know, you go to the drive-in, and again, Ian Hunter oversaw this work. And it works for the film. Yeah. Now, if it was in some modern drama or something like that, we'd laugh at it. But it just works. And it does, what a great solution that doesn't need computer graphics. I'm sure there was some digital compositing. But yeah, that's another kind of miniatures thing that I also really like to see occasionally, where they're using it as almost an homage or an ode to a different era.
Yeah. I guess to answer your question when we first started, is it dead? Is it coming back? Is it never left? I think it will, like you said, coming back all the time, and there will be homages to it, but I don't think it will ever go away. I still think it has a huge place in production, but It is tricky though, because there's a lot of lack of companies to do this, and there's a lot of lack of talent. I remember when I was doing the miniatures for Vermintide from Warhammer, it was really difficult to find the talent to make this. And the few companies that are still making it, they're fully booked. They're like super booked. So it is but there's still a few around, aren't they? Like if you think about it, there's still a few around.
Yeah, I think there's a mix of companies dedicated to it, places like Matson Miniatures, Creation Consultants. As I understand it, New Deal Studios, which was one of the big players, is not really doing it as a company anymore.
Yeah.
But a lot of special effects supervisors pull together individuals to do things, or to do partial miniatures like exploding building sections and things like that. But I wish there were more around. I think there's a bunch of companies doing it for commercials. That would be
Model Makers, wasn't it? Model Makers is doing a lot of commercials.
I hope it's not dead. I really don't think it is. It would be really cool if we were fooled. That's what I really want to be. Fooled by miniature versus CG or versus some other effect.
Yeah. But I just, I feel like we have the technology now to make miniatures what could have never been before. I think that's the fascinating part of this. It's almost like all this miniature work that happened on the 80s and 90s was too soon, and now we actually have the tools to make it work. Which is
yeah.
funny.
Well, it's funny you say that. We might just finish off in a minute. But one thing I remember was in the Star Wars special editions, George Lucas did a lot of fixing, and ILM did this too. But one of the things they had done for, say, some of the optical composites was not process the elements at their full opacity, because it meant that the matte lines weren't as visible.
Yeah.
But if you looked closely, you could see, the transparency. But so ILM could then, in the 90s for the special editions, go and fix those composites to remove that opacity problem.
Yeah.
And I think that's really tapping into what you're saying. We can do it now. We can make it look amazing. Well, Hugo, I think we've covered miniatures in a really fun way, and we've talked about one of your favorite films. Definitely one of my favorite films now in terms of visual effects.
Yeah.
To 2010, but let's go retro a bit more often, and I reckon we can find a bunch of films I haven't seen, and you probably haven't seen as well.
And you were telling me like we should try to see, obviously it goes without saying if we've missed other films that had a lot of miniatures, we apologize for that. But just let us know.
Tell us. Yeah, I'm dying to know. I'm dying to know.
Maybe
TV
there are
shows
films
that
fooled us that we don't know about. I hope so.
Yeah, I reckon I've heard a few stories which maybe I can't repeat, which is where they've built a building to explode, and then it maybe just didn't quite work, and so they ended up replacing it in CG or whatever. I mean, if you want to share any of those stories, you're very welcome to do so.
It's not going to happen, is it? It's not going to happen.
Awesome. Hugo, we always finish with a quick little shout out about where to find us on social media.
Yeah.
And any kind of updates with Hugo's Desk or anything too that you want to mention.
So I just wanted to mention to everyone listening that this week is the anniversary of Hugo's Desk. We are 6 years now running.
Wow.
25th of August is the anniversary of Hugo's Desk. And to celebrate the moment, I always do a live stream to celebrate the anniversary. To celebrate the moment, I'm going to do a 6-hour long stream to celebrate the 6 years. And this will going to be... Yes, I am. On YouTube. So from 2 o'clock in the afternoon UK time on Wednesday, the 25th of August, I'm going to be live on YouTube. I'm going to be doing 6 hours of nuke compositing. So this will be like nuke for beginners. It will be like a 6-hour crash course in nuke compositing for beginners, almost like, nuke for dummies, almost like that. From a production point of view, we're going to use production shots. Going to be 6 hours I'm gonna do 6 giveaways during the stream as well. So we're gonna be there for 6 hours. I hope you can join us. We'll be live on YouTube on Hugo's Desk. Just to celebrate. Just came say hello. Even if you can't stick around, just come over and say hello, and then I can say hello to you as well. It's a big deal. 6 years is a long time. We've had almost 2 million views on the channel, and we are almost at 40,000 subscribers. So yeah. Going there. That's what I'm gonna do this week. So don't forget to connect and to go in.
Congratulations, Hugo. That's awesome about Hugo's Desk. I'd like to announce that I'm doing a 6-hour YouTube stream of me writing articles. You will see 6 hours of me using text editor to.
I know. I already got messages on LinkedIn. Why are you doing 6 hours? What's wrong with you? And I'm saying, yeah, I shouldn't have done that, but it's too late now. I've announced it.
Okay. Nice work.
It's too late. No, I figured that it will be a quite relaxing stream. I'm gonna show some stuff, and we're gonna also chat a lot, and we're gonna talk a lot with the audience. So
Can you show some of the food that you make with your wife as well? That would be really cool.
Oh, we have a new video this week. It's gonna drop also maybe Wednesday, Thursday. It's an amazing vegan pea soup. It's a great soup.
Okay.
Just made of
Awesome.
peas and other stuff as well. Yeah.
Make sure everyone, to find Hugo's Desk, just search on Google. To find me, Ian Fails on Twitter is the best way. And yeah, I think we'll wrap it up there, Hugo.
Yes, we are.
Thanks everyone for listening. Hugo, it was really fun.
Yeah, it was. Thank you so much, guys. See you later. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.